There's something deeply misunderstood about people who seem to have very few friends, especially when those people are highly empathetic. From the outside, their quietness can look like loneliness, insecurity, or an inability to connect. But sometimes the truth is completely different. Sometimes a person has fewer friends because they notice too much. They see things that other people are willing to ignore. They hear what isn't being said. They recognize when someone's words don't match their behavior, when a smile doesn't match an emotion, or when someone's kindness comes with an expectation attached to it. And once you begin noticing those patterns, it becomes very difficult to pretend you don't see them. An empath may walk into a conversation and immediately notice a change in someone's energy. They may recognize hesitation in a person's voice, tension in their body language, or a sudden shift in the way they communicate. They don't necessarily sit there thinking, I'm analyzing this person. It can happen almost automatically. They're sensitive to emotional details, and because they're constantly observing those details, they often understand people on a deeper level than they realize. That's where their social life can become complicated. Most relationships survive because people are willing to overlook certain things. We excuse inconsistencies. We give people the benefit of the doubt. We tell ourselves that someone didn't mean what they said, that their behavior was just a bad day, or that their intentions were probably good. An empath may do the same thing for a while. In fact, they may give more chances than most people because they can understand why someone behaves the way they do. They can see the pain behind someone's anger. They can recognize insecurity behind arrogance. They can understand fear behind emotional distance. But understanding someone doesn't mean you have to tolerate everything they do. Eventually, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. And when an empath reaches that point, they may quietly step back. They don't always create a dramatic confrontation. They don't necessarily announce that they're leaving. Sometimes they simply stop investing the same emotional energy into the relationship. Their replies become shorter. Their presence becomes less frequent. Their availability changes. And one day, someone who thought they had a close friend may suddenly realize that the empath has emotionally moved several steps away. This is one reason people with strong emotional awareness can end up with surprisingly small social circles. They aren't necessarily rejecting people because they think they're better than everyone else. They may simply have become unwilling to maintain connections that constantly make them question their own emotional reality. Think about what happens when you repeatedly discover that someone's words and actions don't match. At first, you explain it, then you excuse it. Eventually, you recognize it as a pattern. And once you recognize a pattern, you can't unknow it. That awareness changes everything. You begin paying attention to who only contacts you when they need something. You notice who celebrates your success and who becomes strangely distant when you begin doing well. You notice who listens when you're struggling and who immediately turns the conversation back toward themselves. You notice who respects your boundaries and who becomes offended when you establish them. You notice who apologizes because they genuinely understand the damage they caused, and who apologizes only because they want access to you again. And perhaps the most important thing you notice is how you feel after spending time with certain people. Some people leave you feeling understood. Others leave you questioning yourself. Some conversations bring peace. Others leave you emotionally exhausted for hours afterward. A highly sensitive person may become increasingly aware of this difference, and eventually they start choosing their relationships based not on quantity but on emotional quality. That's why having fewer friends isn't automatically a sign that something is wrong. Sometimes it means a person has learned to protect their attention. Sometimes it means they've stopped confusing familiarity with friendship. And sometimes it means they finally realize that being surrounded by people is not the same thing as being understood by people. But there is an important warning here. Emotional awareness becomes powerful only when it is balanced with self-awareness. Not every uncomfortable feeling means someone is toxic. Not every disagreement means someone is dishonest. And not every mistake is evidence of bad character. An empath can become so sensitive to emotional signals that they sometimes interpret ordinary human imperfections as threats. The goal isn't to distrust everyone. The goal is to observe without immediately judging, to understand without overabsorbing, and to create boundaries without building walls around your entire life. Because when you learn to recognize people clearly without becoming consumed by their emotions, you stop searching for a crowd and start recognizing the few people who genuinely belong in your life. And sometimes having a smaller circle isn't losing people. It's finally making room for the right ones. There is another reason highly empathetic people often have smaller social circles, and it has nothing to do with being incapable of making friends. In many cases, they simply have a different definition of what friendship means. For them, connection is not measured by how many people know their name, how many messages are sitting in their phone, or how many people they can call when they want to go somewhere. They measure connection by something much deeper: trust, emotional safety, honesty, loyalty, and the feeling that they can be completely themselves without constantly performing. And that difference can make their social world much smaller. An empath may meet dozens of people and genuinely enjoy talking to many of them, but only a handful will ever be allowed into their inner circle. And that's because they aren't simply looking for company. They're looking for authenticity. They want conversations that go beyond appearances. They want relationships where silence doesn't feel uncomfortable, where vulnerability isn't used as ammunition, and where both people can communicate honestly without playing emotional games. For someone with that mindset, superficial relationships can become exhausting. Think about how often people interact without truly connecting. They talk about work, money, entertainment, social media, other people, and everyday problems, but rarely talk about what they actually feel. They can spend hours together and still know almost nothing about each other's inner world. For an empath, that can eventually feel empty, not because small talk is wrong, but because they crave something beyond it. They want to know what motivates you. They want to understand what you fear. They want to know what you believe when nobody is watching. They want to see whether your actions match your words. And when they realize that a relationship is built almost entirely on appearances, they may slowly lose interest. This is why an empath may leave a social gathering and feel more tired than before they arrived. They're not only participating in conversations, they're processing people. They're noticing reactions, reading emotional shifts, sensing tension, and often unconsciously adjusting themselves to the atmosphere around them. If the environment is full of competition, gossip, jealousy, or emotional performance, they can feel overwhelmed, even if everyone appears to be having a good time. Eventually, they begin asking a different question. Not how many friends do I have, but how do I feel when I'm around these people? That question can completely change your relationships. Because once you start valuing emotional quality over social quantity, you stop forcing connections simply because they have existed for a long time. You stop keeping someone close just because you've known them since childhood. You stop calling someone a friend simply because you regularly exchange messages. You begin looking at the actual relationship instead of the label attached to it, and that can be uncomfortable. People may accuse you of becoming distant. They may say you've changed. They may wonder why you don't attend every gathering anymore. They may interpret your boundaries as arrogance or your quietness as rejection. But sometimes you've changed because your standards have changed. You've realized that access to your time is valuable, your emotional energy is valuable, your peace is valuable, and you don't have to give unlimited access to everyone simply because they want it. That doesn't mean becoming cold. It means becoming intentional. A healthy empath doesn't say, nobody can be trusted. They say, trust has to be earned. They don't say, I don't need anyone. They say, I would rather have a few genuine relationships than many relationships that leave me emotionally empty. And there's a profound difference between those two mindsets. The first comes from fear. The second comes from clarity. But there is also a danger in having extremely high standards. If you expect everyone to understand you perfectly, communicate perfectly, and never disappoint you, you may eventually isolate yourself from good people who are simply human. Genuine relationships aren't perfect. People make mistakes. They misunderstand each other. They sometimes say the wrong thing, react emotionally, or fail to recognize what you need. So the goal isn't to find perfect people. The goal is to find people who are willing to grow with you. Look for someone who can admit when they're wrong. Someone who respects your boundaries even when they don't completely understand them. Someone who can celebrate your happiness without competing with it. Someone who can hear your truth without immediately becoming defensive. Someone who doesn't require you to shrink yourself just to keep the relationship comfortable. Those are the connections worth protecting. And when you finally experience that kind of relationship, You understand why an empath may have spent so much time alone. They weren't necessarily searching for more people. They were searching for the right kind of connection. And sometimes the smallest circle can hold the deepest relationships. There's another side to being deeply empathetic that most people never see. It isn't just about understanding what someone else is feeling. Sometimes it's about feeling the atmosphere around you so strongly that you need time alone just to return to yourself. You can walk into a room where everyone is laughing and still sense the person who is uncomfortable. You can sit beside someone who says they're fine and somehow feel that something is wrong. You can have a normal conversation with someone and walk away carrying an emotion that didn't even belong to you in the first place. That is the hidden exhaustion of emotional sensitivity. An empath doesn't always choose solitude because they dislike people. Sometimes they choose it because people affect them deeply. Every interaction can leave an emotional impression. A tense conversation can stay in their mind long after it ends. Someone else's sadness can follow them home. Someone else's anger can change their mood without them consciously realizing why. And when this happens repeatedly, socializing stops feeling simple to become something they have to recover from. Think about what happens when you're around someone who is constantly anxious. Even if they never tell you they're anxious, you may notice their restless movement, their tone of voice, their facial expressions, and the tension in their behavior. Your mind begins processing those signals. You start wondering what's wrong. You may even feel the urge to comfort them, fix the situation, or make the environment more peaceful. Now imagine doing that with almost everyone you meet. That is why some highly empathetic people become extremely selective about who they spend time with. They have learned that not every emotional environment is healthy for them. They understand that being compassionate doesn't mean becoming emotionally responsible for everyone around them, and that lesson can take years to learn. Many empaths grow up believing that if they can sense someone's pain, they should do something about it. If someone is upset, they feel responsible for making them feel better. If someone is struggling, they immediately become the listener. If someone is angry, they try to calm the situation. If someone feels rejected, they may rush in to reassure them. Eventually, they discover something painful. You can care about someone without carrying them. You can understand someone's pain without making it your own. You can support someone without sacrificing your peace. This realization can completely change how an empath approaches friendship. They begin recognizing the difference between compassion and emotional absorption. Compassion says, I understand that you're hurting. Emotional absorption says, because you're hurting, now I must hurt with you. One allows you to remain present, the other can consume you. And when an empath doesn't have strong boundaries, they can become emotionally drained by relationships that are constantly one sided. Maybe someone only calls when they're struggling. Maybe every conversation becomes a crisis. Maybe the empath becomes the therapist, the problem solver, the emotional support system, and the person who is expected to understand everything. But when the empath needs support, suddenly there is nobody available. After enough experiences like that, solitude can begin to feel safer than connection. Not because they stopped caring, because they finally started caring about themselves too. This is one of the reasons an empath with few friends may actually have a very rich inner world. They spend time reflecting, processing, observing, creating, learning, and understanding themselves. They may need quiet mornings, peaceful evenings, or periods where nobody is demanding their attention. That silence isn't necessarily emptiness. Sometimes silence is recovery. Sometimes being alone is how they clear emotional noise that they've collected from everyone else. But there is an important balance here. Emotional sensitivity should not become an excuse to avoid every uncomfortable relationship or every difficult conversation. Life will always involve people with different personalities, opinions, and emotional states. You cannot protect your peace by avoiding humanity altogether. The healthier approach is learning what belongs to you and what doesn't. Someone else's anger doesn't automatically become your anger. Someone else's disappointment doesn't automatically mean you failed. Someone else's insecurity doesn't automatically become your responsibility. Someone else's chaos doesn't have to become your environment. Once you understand that, your empathy becomes a strength instead of a burden. You can listen without absorbing. You can care without losing yourself. You can walk beside someone without carrying them on your back. And perhaps that's when you stop being afraid of having fewer friends. You realize that the purpose of friendship isn't to fill every hour with noise. It's to have people who can share space with you without constantly draining your emotional resources. The right people won't demand that you abandon your sensitivity, they will respect it. And when you learn to protect your energy without closing your heart, solitude stops being something you fear and becomes something that helps you return to yourself. There comes a moment in the life of a deeply empathetic person when they realize that constantly being there for everyone else has left them with very little emotional energy for themselves. They may have spent years listening, forgiving, understanding, giving second chances, and trying to see the best in people. It may have been the person everyone called when something went wrong, the person who stayed awake listening to someone else's problems, the person who offered understanding, even when nobody offered the same understanding in return. But eventually, something changes. They become tired of being the strong one, not because they suddenly stop caring about people, but because disappointment has taught them a lesson that kindness alone cannot teach. They begin to understand that being available to everyone doesn't mean everyone will be available to them, and that realization can make an empath incredibly independent. At first, this independence may come from pain. Maybe they trusted someone deeply and were betrayed. Maybe they gave everything to a friendship only to discover that the relationship was one-sided. Maybe they repeatedly showed up for people who disappeared whenever they needed support. Each experience leaves a small lesson behind. Don't expect everyone to give what you give. Don't assume loyalty simply because you are loyal. Don't mistake someone's need for genuine appreciation. And don't build your emotional stability around people who have never demonstrated that they can carry any of your weight. After enough disappointment, an empath may stop asking for help. They may stop explaining themselves. They may stop reaching out first. They learn how to solve their own problems, process their own emotions, and move forward without waiting for someone else to rescue them. From the outside, this can look like confidence, and sometimes it is. But sometimes there's pain underneath it, because there's a difference between choosing independence and being forced into it by repeated disappointment. A person can become extremely self-sufficient while still secretly wishing someone would finally show up for them. They may say, I can handle it, while quietly hoping that someone will notice they shouldn't have to handle everything alone. That's why emotional independence should never become emotional isolation. You don't have to need nobody just because some people disappointed you. You don't have to close every door because someone once walked through the wrong one. You don't have to punish future relationships for the mistakes of previous ones. The real transformation happens when an empath learns to become independent without becoming emotionally unavailable. They stop depending on people for their identity, their peace, or their sense of worth, but they still allow healthy people to contribute to their life. They learn that receiving support isn't weakness. Trusting someone carefully isn't foolishness. Vulnerability isn't a lack of strength when it is given to someone who has earned it. This is where boundaries become incredibly important. An empath who has been disappointed may previously have believed that saying no was selfish. They might have felt guilty for needing space. They might have answered every call, solved every problem, and tolerated behavior that quietly damaged them. But eventually, they discover that a boundary isn't a punishment, it's information. It tells people how you expect to be treated. And the people who genuinely value you, you will usually learn to respect it. The people who only benefited from your lack of boundaries may be the ones who become angry. That reaction can reveal something important. When you stop doing everything for someone and they suddenly treat you differently, you discover whether they valued you or simply valued what you provided. That can hurt. But clarity is often painful before it becomes peaceful. An empath who develops healthy independence no longer needs to chase people who don't reciprocate. They don't beg for attention. They don't repeatedly explain their worth. They don't force friendships that have already become emotionally empty. They simply step back, and in that quiet distance, they begin rebuilding their relationship with themselves. They learn how to enjoy their own company. They discover that solitude doesn't have to mean rejection. They start trusting their judgment again. They become comfortable making decisions without seeking approval from everyone around them. And strangely enough, this is often when healthier relationships begin to appear. Because when you stop desperately needing people to fill an emotional space inside you, you become much better at choosing people based on who they actually are. You no longer ask, who will stay if I give them everything? You start asking, who consistently shows me that they deserve a place in my life? That is a completely different question. And sometimes having fewer friends is simply the visible result of finally learning that your energy, your trust, and your emotional availability are valuable. You don't have to become hard to become strong. You only have to learn that your kindness deserves boundaries too. There is a quiet quality that often separates deeply empathetic people from those who constantly seek attention. They don't always feel the need to be the loudest person in the room, the funniest person in the conversation, or the person everyone notices. They can sit back and observe. They listen carefully. They notice details. And while everyone else may be focused on what is being said, they are often paying attention to how it is being said, why it is being said, and what might be happening underneath the surface. That quietness can easily be misunderstood. Someone may look at an empath who speaks less and assume they are shy, antisocial, arrogant, or uninterested. But silence doesn't always mean a lack of confidence. Sometimes silence means someone is processing more than they're expressing. Think about the difference between simply hearing someone and actually observing them. Most people hear the words. An observant person notices the pause before the words. They notice the change in tone. They notice when someone's smile disappears for half a second. They notice when a person's behavior changes depending on who enters the room. They notice who becomes generous when attention is on them, and who remains kind when nobody is watching. These details may seem insignificant to someone else, but to an empath, they can reveal an entire emotional story. And because they notice so much, they don't always feel comfortable participating in every social performance. They may watch people competing for approval and quietly wonder why approval matters so much. They may see someone exaggerate in their success and recognize the insecurity underneath it. They may notice someone constantly criticizing others and understand that the criticism may be revealing more about the speaker than the person being criticized. This doesn't mean an empath is always right. It means they are paying attention, and paying attention can make it difficult to become emotionally invested in people who are constantly performing. An empath often wants authenticity. They don't necessarily need you to impress them. They don't need a perfect image. In fact, they may trust someone more when that person admits their mistakes, acknowledges their weaknesses, or simply says, I don't know. Because real connection doesn't require perfection. It requires honesty. This is also why some empaths don't chase social validation. They may enjoy being appreciated, but they don't necessarily need an audience to feel valuable. They can walk away from a conversation without making sure everyone liked them. They can spend an evening alone without immediately feeling that something is missing. And they can choose not to participate in something simply because everyone else is doing it. That level of independence can make them appear mysterious. People may wonder, why don't they talk more? But the better question might be, what are they noticing? Because while others are trying to be seen, the empath may be trying to understand. They're studying patterns. They're listening for consistency. They're watching how people treat those who cannot offer them anything. And that last detail can tell you more about someone's character than almost anything they say. Watch how someone treats a waiter when they're frustrated. Watch how they respond when they don't get their way. Watch what happens when someone else succeeds. Watch how they speak about friends who aren't present. Watch whether they respect a boundary after hearing the word no. An observant person understands that character isn't revealed only during dramatic moments. It's revealed in small moments. And once you become comfortable observing instead of constantly performing, you become much more selective about who receives your trust. But there is another side to this. Being observant can become unhealthy if it turns into constant suspicion. Not every facial expression is a hidden message. Not every delayed reply is rejection. Not every awkward moment is evidence that someone has bad intentions. A mature empath learns to observe without creating stories around every observation. They notice, but they don't immediately assume. They listen, but they don't automatically judge. They remain open to being wrong. That balance is what turns emotional awareness into wisdom. And perhaps that's why an empath with few friends can sometimes appear so calm. They aren't necessarily disconnected from the world. They may simply have stopped trying to prove themselves to it. They don't need to fill every silence. They don't need to explain every decision. They don't need to be constantly surrounded by people to feel complete. They can sit quietly, observe what is happening, and decide whether the environment is something they genuinely want to participate in. That is a powerful form of self control because when you stop performing for acceptance, you gain the freedom to become more authentic. And when you become more authentic, some people may leave, but the people who remain are more likely to be there for who you actually are, not for the version of you that was created to keep everyone comfortable. So if you've ever been called quiet, distant, or difficult to read, don't automatically assume something is wrong with you. Sometimes your silence is simply giving you the space to see what others are too busy performing to notice. And when you learn to observe without judging, listen without absorbing, and speak when your words truly matter, your quietness can become one of your greatest strengths. And eventually, all of these traits lead to one final realization. Having few friends does not have to be a weakness. For someone who feels deeply, notices deeply, and gives deeply, solitude can become a place of strength rather than a place of shame. The world often teaches us to measure our social value by the size of our circle. How many people know you? How many people invite you out? How many names are in your phone? How many people would show up for you? But none of those numbers can tell you whether your relationships are actually meaningful. You can be surrounded by hundreds of people and still feel completely alone. And you can have two or three genuine people in your life and feel more understood than someone with 1,000 connections. That is why the real goal isn't to collect people, it's to cultivate meaningful relationships. For an empath, this can be especially important because their emotional energy is not unlimited. If you spend your days trying to maintain relationships that constantly drain you, eventually you have nothing left for yourself. You begin living according to everyone else's needs, everyone's expectations, everyone's moods, and everyone's problems. Then one day you realize something uncomfortable. You've been so busy being available to everyone else that you became unavailable to yourself. Solitude can interrupt that pattern. When you are alone, there is no emotional atmosphere you have to manage. No one needs an explanation. No one is demanding your attention. No one is asking you to become a different version of yourself. You can simply exist. And in that quiet, you may begin hearing your own thoughts again. You start asking yourself what you actually want instead of what everyone else expects from you. You begin recognizing which relationships make you feel peaceful and which ones leave you exhausted. You start understanding your own boundaries. You become more comfortable saying no. You stop feeling guilty for protecting your time. This is where solitude becomes powerful. But solitude should never become an excuse to completely shut the world out. There's a difference between being alone because you enjoy your own company and being alone because you're afraid that everyone will eventually hurt you. One is healthy independence. The other can become emotional isolation. A strong empath learns the difference. They don't build walls around their heart, they build doors. And the difference is important because a wall keeps everyone out, while a door allows you to decide who comes in. You can remain compassionate without being endlessly accessible. You can remain trusting without being careless. You can love people without making their problems your responsibility. You can enjoy solitude while still allowing genuine friendship into your life. The goal isn't to need nobody. The goal is to stop needing the wrong people. Once you reach that point, your relationships change naturally. You become less impressed by popularity and more interested in character. You stop chasing people who give inconsistent attention. You stop trying to convince someone to appreciate you. You stop believing that history alone is enough to keep a relationship alive. Instead, you look for consistency. You look for someone who respects your boundaries, someone who doesn't disappear when you need support, someone who can celebrate your success without feeling threatened by it, someone who can disagree with you without disrespecting you, someone who can see your sensitivity as a strength instead of something to exploit. Those people may be rare, but rare doesn't mean impossible. And when you find them, you don't need to overwhelm the relationship by demanding constant attention. You can allow it to grow naturally. You can have periods of silence without assuming the friendship is ending. You can give each other space without turning that space into rejection. That is what emotionally mature connection looks like. It doesn't consume you, it complements you. And perhaps the greatest lesson for an empath is this: your life doesn't become more valuable because more people have access to you. Your life becomes more valuable when you become intentional about who receives your time, your trust, your energy, and your heart. So don't be ashamed if your circle is small. Don't compare your private life to someone else's crowded social life. You don't know what exists behind their numbers. What matters is whether the relationships you have allow you to breathe, grow, laugh, speak honestly, and remain yourself. Because at the end of the day, the strongest person isn't always the one surrounded by the most people. Sometimes it's the person who learned to stand alone without becoming bitter, learn to love without losing themselves, and learn that peace is worth protecting. Your circle may be small, but if it is genuine, peaceful, and loyal, it may be more valuable than a crowd that never truly sees you.